we do spend a little bit of time when we work through the scenarios in the book, considering how the economic piece might feature. And the short answer is, I think, the economic parts of the stories can cut both ways, right? And as those of us who've worked a bit on, what we call the economic security nexus, have concluded by now, that that kind of assumption that economic interdependence is good, right, and can necessarily always help to mediate geopolitical tensions is probably a slightly simplistic assumption. Of course, economic interdependence creates competitive and conflictual dynamics of its own as well. But I think the book essentially is arguing or urging a more East Asia focused way of thinking about East Asia, right? And in that regard, I think the trends of, what you're calling deglobalization, trends possibly of decoupling between the US and Chinese economies particularly, the prominence of economic sanctions and other tools of, coercion, if you like, these, to me, create more intra-East Asia pressures that can be expected to grow, right? And these pressures, paradoxically in a way, I think also push towards an increased imperative for China and Japan to reach some kind of economic bargains for coexistence, for productive competition, and for complementary collaboration. I mean, the thing about their economic profiles, when you look at it, is how, of course, yes, there are increasingly competitive elements, but how fundamentally their economic comparative advantages have remained complementary. Now, that therefore means that there are intrinsic structural incentives for cooperation, at least in the short to medium term. Couple that with the threats of decoupling, deglobalization leading to the growing importance of regional supply chains and so on and so forth. It sets up a series of pressures, I think, for both the Japanese and the Chinese to pay way more attention to the Northeast Asian economy, political economy, right, system in its own right, than otherwise might have been the case. So I'm not one of these people who thinks necessarily that the trends of deglobalization or decoupling are necessarily one of those increasing competitive dynamics that will necessarily lead China and Japan down the path of irresolvable conflict, certainly in the economic realm.
You can develop a quite compelling argument there that the actual, prioritizing economic growth and development did spur a lot of the collaboration that you're talking about, and gave rise to the sort of the long Asian peace after, the Vietnam War and so forth. And the challenge now is that when you look at what's happening with Korea and Japan and, them falling apart, a whole variety of different issues, and China and Japan, especially now over Taiwan. I mean, what's happening now is it sort of does seem to be a great unraveling, that the interdependence which existed and which generated a lot of the peace does seem to be unraveling. I mean, you're confirming your sort of sense of instability. So the question I guess right now is there something functionally equivalent to that sort of developmental imperative that will get things back on track?
I don't think that the developmental imperative has gone anywhere. I think it still remains absolutely important. Again, there's always a tendency, isn't it, that we want to have this argument. Is security more important, or is economics more important? And of course, what's particularly marked in the East Asian context is that we've always thought about security primarily through the lens of economic development, and tied that in with regime performance legitimacy, tied that in also with all the varieties of, crony capitalism, patron-client relations, rent-seeking that goes on throughout the East Asian region, right? So I don't think the development imperative has gone anywhere. A certain kind of developmentalist idea has evolved, particularly with China's entry into this game. The developmentalism that we might want to see in East Asia is no longer the kind of developmentalism that we identified with the first wave of, the newly industrialized countries, of which Japan and Korea were at the forefront, where we're looking at a very different landscape of developmentalism these days. But the developmental imperative, the way I've described it, hasn't gone anywhere, it's still there. So the challenge, of course, is this notion of how, the variegated types of economic strategies and tactics, to some degrees, if we think about things like economic sanctions as tactics, for various states can be brought to bear new configurations, right, of how that sort of developmentalism can still be supported within the national economies, but within this shifting context, I think. Mm-hmm. And so I'd say that, that's a very fast-moving landscape, of course, but we can't any longer sort of hold on to the kinds of assumptions that we reflexively did. Developmentalism is not necessarily liberal in that sense, certainly not neoliberal in the previous sense. It's very much tied to authoritarian forms of very statist, explicitly state-centric, state-led types of development, in large part, of course, because of the China model. Financing, etc. So that very landscape is shifting. We do see Japan sort of pushing back against some manifestations of this. The Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. No, that's not what it's called. What is it called? The new Japanese-led initiative for alternative infrastructure funding in the region, for example, is one of these manifestations of how Japan is pushing back against, the sort of quite Chinese-centered notions of developmentalism. We'll see how that goes. As far as the region is concerned, though, this sets up a fairly sort of productive sort of competitive dynamic. The result is that everyone else has, lots more infrastructure financing going around, for example. Now, it would be great if they could compete that way on things like green technology, right? Circling back around to what Barry was saying earlier about that meta threat of climate change and the need to sort of massively speed up our ways of responding to this. And of course, green tech is one of those areas that is not just China and Japan. Korea is very important in this as well. And that's one area of what I see as potentially very productive forms of economic competition that we can expect to be fostered and is indeed ongoing. So again, I'm a bit resistant to the idea that dynamics only flow in one direction, I suppose.
So can you give us some sort of sense about what you see as the prospects for CBMs, for practical competence building measures, for trust building to kind of deal with the deficit that's sort of growing, and how to avoid this kind of seemingly remorseless trend towards a new global containment strategy?
I suppose my starting view on this, and it may be my ending view as well, is that at the moment, and indeed I think over the past few decades, trust building is something that the Chinese have talked a lot about and proved extraordinarily poor at doing. And I don't see that as changing anytime soon. I'm still struggling as to why this is the case. I'm pretty convinced that it is the case, and it may have something quite deep to do with what foreigners who go to China are generally presented as called the Chinese way of thinking. I know that sounds terrible, but that's what the Chinese say whenever foreigners give them a puzzled look about, what the hell is going on here? Chinese way of thinking, they say. And I used to laugh that off a bit and say, well, yeah, okay, that's just a kind of polite formula for saying I can't be bothered to explain this to you. But I'm beginning to think now that there may be a kind of deeper Chinese way of thinking, which, to be brief about it, is more comfortable with living with contradictions than certainly Westerners are. Chin Ya-Ching has talked a lot about Chongyong dialectics and as opposed to Hegelian dialectics, that in Hegelian dialectics, contradictions are a problem and need to be resolved, and the process is often conflictual. In Chinese dialectics, as Chin Ya-Ching explains it, that's not the same. Right? The contradictions are recognized as being there, but they're taken as being more or less permanent conditions that need to be managed, not necessarily resolved. And this way of thinking might explain how the inconsistent, what would appear to outsiders to be a kind of extraordinary inconsistencies in Chinese foreign policy. How is it that they can present themselves as the great defenders of sovereignty and non-intervention on the one hand, and more or less feel comfortable with claiming primacy in their region on the other hand? These thoughts come out of both sides of the mouth at the same time, and the Chinese clearly feel comfortable with them in the way that others don't. So there may be a quite deep problem here about ways of thinking about these things and what is seen as a problem and what is not. So while outsiders may see Chinese foreign policy as very inconsistent and try and explain this, bureaucratically, because there are so many different agencies involved in foreign policy making in China, or because nobody's really in charge of it, that kind of thing. It seems to me that there is a kind of underlying deep problem here. I think there's also an opportunity, and it's something that puzzles me a bit that the Chinese have not made more of, in the sense that, they're, as I suggested, their rather expansive view of the Chinese reunification project makes much of the neighborhood, indeed some of the other great powers, particularly the US, feel very uneasy. And it doesn't look like that's going to go away anytime soon. But there are some opportunities. I go back to climate change again. Why on earth have the Chinese not taken more of a lead on climate change? It's something they could do with absolutely no contradiction, or very little contradiction, with their domestic policy, in the sense that the domestic policy is already quite geared up for dealing with pollution issues and dealing with some aspects of climate change. But their foreign policy is not. They, by and large, still take the global South line that this is a problem for the early developing countries, mainly the West and Japan. They did all the early pollution, and therefore they should pay for most of it. Now, okay, there's some logic in that argument, but when you're all in the same boat and it's sinking, it's time to bail, not to be resorting to arguments like that. And it seems to me that taking a lead on climate change would fit the book of the Chinese Communist Party extremely well. It almost has to be taking a long-term view because it claims the right to govern forever, essentially. So taking that long-term view, looking to the responsibility of the present to future generations, looking to the ability to be able to make long-term consistent policy, all this fits very well with the playbook of the Chinese Communist Party, and they're not doing it. Right? So there are opportunities there which might be paraded in front of them if they just haven't seen them, where you might get some trust building. But I think it's going to be an uphill struggle.
And what do you see as the prospects for sort of regional security discussions, dialogues, summit meetings, and so forth?
Pretty poor at the moment, I would think. I mean, I'm not a great expert on this, but as I suggested before, my general feel about things is that we are drifting towards Cold War II and towards a degree of polarization and separation and disengagement, treating each other as threats and looking to establish more autonomy. It might be thought that, certainly under the Trump administration, America, I think, favored a more hostile international environment because Trump wanted, that's a very old trick to play, that you create a sense of a hostile external environment in order to increase your domestic cohesion when you're interested in making radical political reforms. And I think that was very much the Trump agenda, to the extent that one can credit Trump with coherence on things like this. But I think it's very much the agenda of Xi Jinping and his government. He wants to make radical political reforms by reasserting the control of the party over everything in society. And it's very convenient to have an external environment that you can present as threatening in order to do that and to help pull the country together. And that seems to be working reasonably well for them at the moment. So in my view, the dynamic is going in the opposite direction, and it's more about coalition building or camp building in order to establish the two sides of this new Cold War.
This can be quite a difficult conversation to have, of course. As someone who's been doing a lot of work on what I call hierarchical orders in international relations for the last 10 or more years, I've come to realize that these conversations are plagued with preconceptions that we bring, different preconceptions that different people bring to these terms. So I'll give you my take on this, right? Along with other sort of colleagues who work on this stuff, what I've really wanted to do is to try and move beyond the caricatures, right, of the Asian obsession with face or status competition, right? And where I'd like to enter this is to say two things, right? Competition and hierarchy are not bad things, right? There's always a bit of a sort of judgment, when the term is trotted out. Hierarchy is a bad word, competition is normal in any crowded geopolitical landscape like East Asia. It's normal. This is why I say to the Australians all the time, competition is normal. It's okay, right? You just don't want it to spill over into outright sustained armed conflict, but competition is normal. Secondly, hierarchy is also normal in international affairs. Right? If we understand hierarchy simply to mean, the sort of multiple inequalities of power, right? All international relations is hierarchical, right? It's only the sort of organized hypocrisy of Westphalian sovereign equality that makes us think that is abnormal. Hierarchies are normal in international affairs, and so it's not that there is anything peculiar about East Asian comfort, and it's not just a Sinic East Asia, but a general relative comfort with notions of multiple inequalities of power in the region, much more so than in other parts of the world, simply because that is the reality, stark reality of regional life, multiple inequalities of power. So the way to connect those is to think about it this way, I think, that hierarchies in of themselves are not bad things. They're quite normal. But the thing that we're concerned about is functioning social hierarchies are essential for stable relations and reliable and predictable interactions, in this case, among states, right? And that's kind of what we mean in the sort of great power bargain sort of model, if you like, in the book, when we say there's got to be a shared set of mutual understandings about who you are and who I am, and now what social system are we in, and what roles do we each play, right? Yes, some of that might relate to hierarchy, but not necessarily. But essentially, that's what we mean by like that stability of the social system, right? So functioning social hierarchies are important for stable relations. And in the book, there is a long history chapter that spans 1400 to 1900, in a way, a weird and wonderful chapter. But really the purpose of that weird chapter there is to show very clearly the many ways in which China and Japan, tried to and did sometimes achieve strategic bargains in a variety of hierarchical settings, right? These have never been equal powers, ever. They're not today, they never have been in their long shared history. Nevertheless, there are interesting episodes in which they definitely strove for strategic bargains, and sometimes achieved them. Some of these episodes were very competitive. Most of them were very fractious. They very often didn't actually reach deep-seated agreements. They were all in very uncertain transitions of order or power or social dynamics in the domestic realm of each of these countries. But in all these cases, what we see for China and Japan is that they demonstrated agility, creativity, certainly a lot of hybridity in how they actually achieved these bargains with each other, including the use of intermediaries, non-state actors, and so on and so forth. So, that's the kind of message that we're kind of hoping to bring through this book, right? Moving beyond the sort of stark assumptions and judgments that we make on these things, translating across the historical context to show that ideas like hierarchy are not alien. They indeed are quite endemic and very relevant today. If you don't like the word hierarchy, then another way to think about it, as one reviewer has done, I think, for the book, is to think about it, in terms of asymmetry, right? Again, it's another way to think about that sort of multiple inequalities of power, another way to access the idea that China and Japan are by no means equal, never have been. It's that asymmetry or the inequality, if you like, that I think creates space for innovation and for selectivity in their relationship with each other. And I choose to see the upside of this as, the space to create opportunities.
And I'd just like to thank, on behalf of the Toda Peace Institute, Evelyn and Barry for both their book, which I think is a provocative one, and Hugh for his questioning and thinking through the kind of the key issues. It leaves us in a kind of a bit of a quandary in a way, because we have a program that's dedicated towards how do we begin thinking about how to mobilize domestic constituencies and international actors around that building of trust and creating an environment which is conducive to negotiations and the sort of bargaining that you're talking about in the book, and how to maintain optimism in the face of the Quad and the kind of desire to sort of constantly sort of identify areas in which China and Japan are kind of seen to be in an antagonistic relationship. So I think you've given us much to chew on, and I want to thank you both for giving of your time and for your wisdom on these issues. And I'm sure that we're going to hear a lot more, both from you and from others, about how do we make sure that the long peace in Northeast Asia remains and doesn't lapse into a kind of an uneasy Cold War, or alternatively, stoushes over the South China Seas, or worse, issues around North and South Korea and so forth. But thank you very much for being with us, for sharing your wisdom, and for an excellent book.